Welcome to the Island of Evil, a place where hundreds of people lost their lives and those who survived were left with lifelong, horrific traumas. This was no ordinary prison, but rather a site specifically designed to break the human spirit in the most brutal ways imaginable. I am certain that most of you have never heard of Goli Otok. For years, this institution remained a secret, even to the inhabitants of Yugoslavia, the country it was located in. Those who returned alive seldom spoke of what they endured there. In fact, many, after their stay on this island, remained silent for years, withdrawing from all communication. Now, years after it ceased operation and following the dissolution of Yugoslavia, much more is known about this place and the exact nature of what transpired there. Be prepared for disturbing content, as this narrative unveils the horrific events that took place on this secluded island, far from the world's eyes. Goli Otok, translating to Barren Island in English, was an infamous prison island located in the Adriatic Sea, part of what was then Yugoslavia. It gained notoriety as a site of immense suffering and inhumane treatment of prisoners. This desolate island, devoid of natural cover and harsh in its climate, became operational as a prison shortly after the end of World War II, around 1949. Its formation was closely tied to the political climate of the time. After the Tito-Stalin split in 1948, when Yugoslavia broke off relations with the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies, Goli Otok was established to detain and re-educate those suspected of pro-Stalin sentiments or accused of being informants and traitors to Tito's regime. The prison was a tool in a larger political struggle, aiming to eliminate opposition and enforce loyalty to Tito's vision of communism. Inmates of Goli Otok were primarily political prisoners. These included members of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia and other individuals who were suspected of sympathizing with the Soviet Union or opposing Tito's policies. Their imprisonment was often the result of mere suspicion or accusations without substantial proof. The objective was not only to punish, but also to forcefully reorient their political beliefs through brutal means. The purpose of Goli Otok was twofold: punishment and indoctrination. The methods employed were notoriously brutal, involving physical torture, psychological abuse, and forced labor. Prisoners were subjected to harsh conditions, with inadequate food and medical care. The island's isolation made it an ideal location for such a facility, as it was out of public view and difficult for information to leak out. This combination of extreme physical hardship, isolation, and ideological warfare aimed to break the will of the prisoners. From 1949 to 1956, Goli Otok was a scene of harrowing and horrifying events. One of the most gruesome practices included gladiatorial fights, where prisoners were forced by guards to fight each other, sometimes even to the death. A variety of torture methods were employed, but one particularly brutal welcome ritual for new inmates was a gauntlet. New prisoners had to walk between two rows of people, long 2 kilometers, who beat them with various objects as they passed. However, beyond the physical torture, the greatest suffering often came from hunger and, particularly, thirst. On this barren, stone island, devoid of any vegetation and surrounded by the sea, exposed directly to the unforgiving sun, the prisoners were subjected to daily abuse. But what the survivors remember as the most excruciating torment was the unrelenting thirst. The island's climate and geography exacerbated the already brutal conditions. The lack of natural cover meant no respite from the scorching sun, and the surrounding sea served as a cruel reminder of the water that was just out of reach. This environment, combined with insufficient and often contaminated water supplies, made thirst a constant and unbearable agony. One of the most notorious methods of torture employed in Goli Otok was known as the Spanish water, or Spanish swimming. This involved placing a person on a table and securing them firmly. One guard would block the prisoner's mouth and hold their head, while another poured water through their nose. This horrific method caused drowning and suffocation sensations in the victims and proved to be highly effective for extracting information. Under this unbearable torment, prisoners often confessed to crimes they had not committed, driven by a desperate desire to end their suffering. In addition to this, there were numerous other methods where victims were tied up, with rats placed on their chests to bite them, and many other unspeakable acts of brutality that are too gruesome to describe in detail here. Another effective method was the deprivation of sleep, which could last for several days, coupled with brutal interrogation. This relentless exhaustion both mental and physical, broke down the prisoners' resistance, making them more susceptible to coercion and manipulation. While murders did occur within the prison, they were not the main objective and were kept as a tightly guarded secret. A particularly haunting memory is recalled by Jovan Shevalievich, a survivor of Goli Otok. He recounted an event where a young man was brought to the prison's infirmary after a night of relentless torture. In a desperate act to escape his torment, the young prisoner managed to extract a nail from a plank of wood and, using his shoe, drove it into his temple. He was still alive when they took him away. These accounts paint a chilling picture of Goli Otok, leaving scars that would last a lifetime. Furthermore, the psychological warfare waged within the prison was just as brutal. Prisoners were systematically turned against each other, a method designed not only to break their spirits, but also to destroy any semblance of solidarity or camaraderie that might have offered some comfort. This internal division further added to the atmosphere of fear and mistrust, making survival an even more solitary and daunting struggle. At Goli Otok, the prisoners were categorized into several groups, each with a distinct status and corresponding name, thereby creating a hierarchy of torment. New convicts were referred to as the New Gang, and were subjected to particularly brutal treatment. In the cells, prisoners were beaten and sometimes killed if they refused to confess to returning to Tito's path, and were branded as enemies of the state. These daily beatings within the cells were known as pilav. Those who were boycotted wore red bands on their trousers, marking them as state enemies. Every evening, they were forced to run a gauntlet where many people would beat them. These prisoners were deprived of sleep until 3 a.m. and were made to scrub and clean incessantly. Often, these conditions drove people to suicide. The psychological torment extended beyond physical abuse. The government devised ways to humiliate not only the prisoners, but also their families. Wives of the convicts were publicly shamed and boycotted. Many were forced to divorce their husbands who were imprisoned on Goli Otok. Family members often lost their jobs, and the stigma of being related to a Goli Otok prisoner lingered for years. Approximately 40,000 prisoners passed through Goli Otok. Aleksandar Rankovic, the deputy president of Yugoslavia, admitted that 47% of these were innocent. Many who served their sentences were returned to camps for so-called re-education. These repeat offenders, known as dvomotorci, were treated with particular cruelty, brutally beaten and subjected to various forms of abuse. The release of a prisoner was conditional upon the authorities' judgment that the individual had recognized their mistake, and finally saw Tito's Communist Party as the progressive force leading them towards a bright and free future. Survivors, upon returning home, did not speak of their ordeals, not even with their families. The most profound psychological torture was the enforced isolation and betrayal among the prisoners. Despite being surrounded by fellow inmates day and night, the complete solitude was unbearable. Sharing even the slightest detail with another could endanger both, as guards would force prisoners to betray each other over the most trivial and inconsequential information. If the guards were unsatisfied, which was often the case, prisoners had to invent stories, leading to torment for things that never happened or were never said. The most terrifying aspect of Goli Otok was perhaps the arbitrary nature of imprisonment. Many found themselves there merely on the basis of an accusation of working against the government, without evidence, trial, or the right to legal defense. The line between innocent remark and political crime was perilously thin, and something as trivial as a joke about Marshal Tito or the Communist Party could have dire consequences. Casual conversations, often overheard and reported by informants, were enough to seal one's fate. Citizens lived under the constant threat that a simple, offhand comment could be twisted into a seditious act, leading to their disappearance into the prison system. It was not uncommon for neighbors, colleagues, even friends to report on each other, motivated by fear, jealousy, or attempts to curry favor with the authorities. The mere act of being reported, regardless of the evidence or lack thereof, could result in arrest and transportation to Goli Otok, where the brutal re-education process awaited. The psychological impact extended beyond the prisoners to their families. Family members were often coerced into publicly renouncing their relatives, be it a husband, wife, brother, or parent, who were accused of anti-state activities. This public disowning, a painful, and humiliating ordeal was a way for the regime to enforce loyalty and break down familial bonds, further isolating the individual from any form of support. Refusing to disown a family member could result in social ostracization, loss of employment, and even risk the family being targeted by the state. One of the UDBA's, Yugoslavian secret police methods of torture, was the aforementioned dvomotorstvo. After releasing some prisoners from Goli Otok, they would be rearrested and brought back to the camp. These returnees faced even more brutal treatment, enduring relentless beatings and other forms of cruelty. In total, Goli Otok bore witness to the suffering of 16,101 detainees, both male and female. Tragically, 413 individuals lost their lives within its confines, succumbing to various causes. It was finally shut down in 1956. 60 years have passed since the closure of Goli Otok, and former inmates are still waiting for proper rehabilitation and recognition of their equal rights as citizens. Many files of Goli Otok prisoners remain unopened, and in Serbia, justice for these individuals and their families is still pending. Goli Otok, now part of Croatia, has transformed from a notorious prison island into a site open for tourism. Visitors can explore this historical landmark, a reminder of its past, and gain insights into a significant chapter of 20th century history.